Let's wait a few minutes for attendees to join. Joining, so that's good. This is working. All right, maybe we can start and go ahead given the time restriction we have. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on sustainable and inclusive energy solutions in refugee camps. I'm Firat Demir from the Department of Economics at the University of Oklahoma, co-director of OU Center for Peace and Development, and a senior researcher at the Security in Context Network. The CPD's mission is to advance knowledge of local peace-building efforts and to work alongside local civil society organizations committed to bottom-up community transformation. The Security in Context is an interdisciplinary research and pedagogy initiative that promotes critical research and policy analysis around key questions related to peace and conflict, political economy, development, and militarism. For those of you who would like to explore both centers further, please visit our websites at ou.edu/CPD and securityincontext.com. We will have Q&A during the last 15 minutes of our talk, but please feel free to post your questions using the Q&A window. The chat window will be disabled, so please do use the Q&A window for any of your questions, and I will take them at the very end, last 15 minutes. Before introducing our panelists, I'd like to thank our CPD fellows, Salma Akhtar Surma, a Ph.D. student in planning, design, and construction, and Shinedu Nusude, who also is a Ph.D. student at the Department of Geography and Environmental Sustainability here at the University of Oklahoma. Salma and Shinedu have spearheaded the planning of this webinar, and their research interests intersect many of the topics we'll discuss today. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists with a few words. Dr. Sarah Rosenberg-Jansen is an independent academic scholar and the research lead for the Global Platform for Action for Sustainable Energy Solutions in situations of displacement. Sarah is an expert advisor on humanitarian energy with experience leading sustainable energy work with displaced communities in several countries. Her research interests focus on renewable energy solutions in refugee camps, the energy lives of displaced people, and understanding how humanitarian systems can provide inclusive and ethical opportunities for vulnerable communities. Our second guest is Dr. Alison Halford, who is an assistant professor and a research fellow at the Center for Computational Science and Mathematical Modeling at Coventry University. Her research looks at ways to facilitate community engagement and capacity building that promotes greater inclusion and equality in decision-making. As a transdisciplinary scholar, Alison's work aims to dismantle knowledge silos between different disciplines and across sectorial boundaries to develop new ways of thinking about real-world problems. Our third guest is Nazifa Rafa, who is a Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Geography at the Cambridge University. Nazifa is an interdisciplinary researcher and scholar in environmental and political geography, and her interests lie in different aspects of human-environment interactions, including water energy and energy security, disaster risks, waste management, and biodiversity conversation in the Global South. Nazifa is committed to both problem-driven research and evidence-based policymaking to tackle environmental challenges and improve the environmental health and disaster resilience of impoverished and marginalized communities. Now, before further ado, I'll pass it to our panelists. Perhaps we can go in the same order, but so should we start with Sarah first?
Sure, very happy to. Let me just share my screen in that case. I have a couple of slides. Okay, just to check you can see that. Okay, yeah, great. So just to have a little introduction for a couple of minutes, I'm actually going to talk more about climate action. Of course, energy is part of that, but looking really at how we understand energy in displaced contexts. And as a highlight, news fresh off the press, I have a new title at the GPA, which is External Advisor. Sorry, I probably should have sent that for a bio update. External Advisor to the Global Platform for Action on Sustainable Energy and Displacement Settings, as the GPA go through a governance rework. And as one of its co-founders, we thought it was very much time to let in the next generation. I know you're thinking I'm too young to let in the next generation, or you better be thinking that. So my talk today, I'm just going to give a really, really brief overview of some of the issues, and then in the conversation, hopefully we can dig into a couple of these topics. The first thing I want to flag is that when we think about humanitarian energy, we think about displaced people, all types of displaced people, including internally displaced people. Some people refer to that as refugees who haven't crossed a border, because famously refugees are people who have crossed a border. And I put up some statistics on this slide to highlight that actually the vast majority of displaced people in the world are not refugees. They are internally displaced people, they are returnees, stateless people, other people of concern, and actually a smaller number, only about 20 million, 25 million probably now with Ukraine, are forced over borders as refugees. So a little bit of finicky-ness there about terminology, because many people say refugee energy, whereas specifically humanitarian energy is broader than that. Another thing to flag is when we talk about the energy needs of displaced people, that many displaced people are not just in refugee camps, both because they're not refugees, but also because they don't live in camps. I think the media version of refugee camps is either the picture on the top left with the very many white tents and the truck rolling across, or the top right of people in very informal tents or shelters that have literally just fled an emergency. Whereas actually the middle set of pictures is also representative of humanitarian energy and the types of contexts that people face. And very often when I speak to students, I say, you can very clearly see energy and electricity and firewood in all of these pictures once you start looking. And then you start to understand some of the complexity of both the situations in terms of humanitarian contexts and situations in terms of energy access that we focus on. Thirdly, I want to just flag that when we talk about the energy needs of displaced people, we're not just talking about their homes and their living spaces. We're also talking about their businesses, their community facilities, and their institutions. And very importantly, specifically in the refugee camps that I work in a lot, we're looking at informal businesses, informal economies, markets and businesses and enterprises that have been set up, often very, very small scale, by one or two individuals. And those individuals need power, they need cooking, and they need electricity, lighting, all the things we understand to be energy. And they basically self-source that independently of the humanitarian system. At the bottom left there, you'll see a picture of one of the bigger investments that are happening, where you have these big solar farms or microgrids or mini grids happening. But actually, a lot of the work that we see is very informal, is very small scale energy technologies. Before I move on to some of the policy and political contexts, I also want to flag that energy is cooking as well as electricity. And as the pictures here show, there's a huge diversity of energy needs. And a lot of that, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is firewood and is charcoal, is cooking using very basic either three-stone fire technologies or very basic cook stoves. This is not so much about LPG distribution or modern electric cooking. It could be, and perhaps it should be, but right now the vast majority of displaced people in sub-Saharan Africa use firewood or charcoal for cooking. And the big electrical installations, as you see in the picture in the top left, which is the electricity grid running over the top of Kigeme camp in Rwanda, are present in some of these places, but they're not connecting households. And that top left picture where you see the mountains rolling and the pylons sticking up, that is the national grid of Rwanda flowing literally over the top of the camp, that it does not connect to the households in those camps. And so people say there's no electricity here, and you look up and you say, well, what about that massive pylon? And people say, oh, that's not for us, that's for somebody else. And so even when electricity is present, it's not often connected, not in a large scale way that we would understand in the global north. Right, I don't want to rattle on for too long. I wanted to flag a couple of resources. First is our State of the Humanitarian Energy Sector set of reports. We did the first one in 2022, and there's just been a new one released at the end of last year. We call them SOAS reports that really cover so much of these issues in detail. And so I wanted to flag that as a resource for anybody looking for that. And just to highlight a couple of statistics that very sadly, the picture is getting worse in humanitarian energy. Energy access rates are falling in real terms, and achieving SDG 7 in displacement contexts is further away than ever. Previous modelling by Chatham House shows that for cooking and electricity on this slide. This slide is about who lacks access to energy in humanitarian settings. So in 2014, Chatham House estimated that 77% of displaced people in camps use basic fuels for cooking, and that figure has risen, so the picture has gotten worse, to 81% using basic fuels for cooking in 2022. And for electricity, somewhat shockingly, the picture has got even worse. In 2014, they were suggesting that 89% of people in refugee camps and displaced people camps have no access to power, and in 2022 it's 94%. And so this is, the picture is getting worse, is the short summary there. And it's very importantly, sustainable energy access rates are not keeping pace with the rate of displacement. And perhaps in the conversation we can get into why that is, because this isn't actually about people losing access to energy. It's about the rates of displacement increasing overall globally very, very rapidly. Couple of points just on governance. Sometimes when I talk to students in academic audiences, they're very surprised by this slide. When we talk about who governs and who is in charge of energy and displacement settings, it's everybody and nobody. If it's anybody, it's soft coordination and governance by the GPA, but it's also all the logos on this slide having very important roles to play. The big humanitarian agencies, UNHCR, IOM, WFP, sometimes FAO, understood to be having the responsibility and the accountability, but in practice, they are doing control and access, whereas international bodies and very often other UN bodies and other large-scale initiatives like SC for All, providing expertise and skills, implementing partners, the groups that we would know traditionally as NGOs, really, doing delivery and distribution and often access to services, research organisations playing a very important role here in terms of knowledge and evidence, and the donors, of course, the ubiquitous, all-powerful donors doing funding, money and power. And together, this group of very disparate actors coming together in various coalitions to do projects and do energy access. Again, perhaps something to discuss in the discussion. A final piece that I wanted to flag is there really is a lot of talk, and for those of you tuned into the COP and the Global Refugee Forum in December, and all the various different pledges that were made by the different organisations, there's a lot of noise in the system. But when you look at the figures, the situation is getting worse. And whilst we have some picture of clean cooking access in households and sustainable electricity access in households, in terms of sustainable energy for institutions, how the UN is powering itself, we don't know. We have an idea, we have a sketch, but we don't have proper data or accountable evidence. And that's something that I say loudly and proudly to the UN, as well as in audiences like this. So just to flag that, you can see a beautiful policy document as highlighted on the left there by UNHCR and others. But when you look at the facts, it's a fairly hard picture. Finally, I'm sorry, I hate slides, but just on this last slide, and I hate self-promotion, but for those of you who are coming from that scholarly background, I've written a couple of papers on this, and of course we have the GPA State of the Humanitarian Energy Sector report, which really goes into the detail of this and provides the case studies and the evidence far more so comprehensively and intelligently than I'm able to in sort of 10 minutes. So I will stop there, and I will stop sharing because I'm very interested to hear what the other panelists have to say. Thank you.
Alison?
Thank you. So I would attempt to share my screen. Is that okay? Can everyone see the screen? Brilliant, thank you. So interestingly, Sarah has led beautifully into what I'm going to talk about, which is I'm going to talk about camp-based refugees. So this is the community that we worked with. And the reason that Sarah mentioned how critical it is to understand, because when we refer to refugees as a homogeneous mass, we fail to recognize that there are discrete issues that these communities have, and that if we have a one-size-fits-all approach, or even talk about them as sort of as if somehow that their problems are there are universal problems around fuel poverty, but sometimes the solutions need to reflect the particular context. So what do we know? What do we know? Well, we know there are long-standing barriers to the acceleration of new technologies in the displaced setting. And I think I'm only going to identify 5. There is far more than that. One is that funding circles for camp-based refugees are short-term. And this really has challenges around policies and implementations, but also brings into the discussion how politicized it is if you start to see these camp-based refugees as temporary, as permanent rather than temporary communities. And so that, to a degree, does limit access to energy. Would you build an infrastructure that's permanent if the political climate is that they should be seen as something as transient? The second thing we're really aware of is there's gaps in methodologies. We recognise that often estimations or any kind of guidance around energy uses patterns very rarely reflect the lived experience of refugees. And as such, it's very hard, therefore, to predict or meet the needs as well as the aspirations of refugees unless we have this understanding. The third point, again, is protocols. One of the challenges we have as academics, particularly as academics, and upon this, I will draw upon the experiences we've had working in this setting, in the displaced setting, was often what we design is in the lab. We then take it into the field, and it's difficult in the lab to predict in this what sort of the barriers to, for example, poor use of internet, or the systems are not sufficiently robust. So for us, it's often the protocols don't reflect the complexity and the challenges of working in a particularly difficult environment. The fourth is data scarcity. Without data, we need an awful lot of data. Increasingly, we're looking at ways we can use AI. If we're starting to look as a whole as a society to become more digitally ready for energy systems, because ultimately energy is the golden thread, as it's been said. And so we need to get communities to be resilient, and the way to be resilient is to be digitally ready for the AI-informed cyber-physical energy systems. But energy for refugees isn't even at that stage. We can't predict their demand. We can't even get them to that point, because we don't even know we can't even predict their needs. And so they are not benefiting from the digital, the digital divide is greater for them. And we are embedding that discrimination and inequality, because we have not started from the point of collecting data that reflects their narratives and their experiences. And lastly, as with any setting, there are operational challenges, particularly around skills, around resources, and of course, funding. So what I'm going to share now in the next sort of 7 or 8 minutes is what we learned, the learnings we gained from working on a project called HEATH, Humanitarian Engineering and Energy for Displacement. And Sarah was heavily involved with this, as in her role as Head of Humanitarian Energy for Practical Action. And this was a interdisciplinary research, and we were one of the first projects to actually use sensors to collect data as well as qualitative findings. And the idea that would go some way forward to really be able to have a very clear empirical body of data that would be able to help predict and future-proof energy interventions in the humanitarian space. if you'd like to know more, we have a website with the publications and also more about our learnings. So what can I tell you? Well, I'm going to start off by really amplifying the voice of the people concerned. So we worked in two settings. We worked in Nepal with internally displaced people due to the earthquake in 2015. And we also worked in 3 refugee camps in Rwanda, Kigembe, Kigembe and Nikembe, which they're all very similar, but we did different interventions. And one of the interventions we did in one of the camps was a standalone solar system, which provided electricity for a community hall. And within it, there were sockets. And what we found that we very much centered around this idea of co-creation, co-design, and co-delivery. And in order to do in enabling the community to make decisions around how and what and where energy would be provided, we hope to maximize the benefits of that energy. And one of the most interesting things, two examples, was one was in having free energy to the hall, they were able to find funding as a community to get a television, because football is huge in the camps. And this allowed them to come together to watch football, which may sound quite insignificant, but often in crisis, particularly in camps where they live lives of where they have a heightened insecurity. Social activities are a way of helping them to feel some connectivity. The second thing we found was that as women became more confident in accessing community managed energy, the other activities emerged. And what we found that in Rwanda, they have every month they have a day of remembrance where they do service. And what they did within this camp was they used that day to come to the hall and be able to remember their own dead. They were Congolese refugees. And we thought that was really critical that they were able to create this point of, I suppose, of creating their own legacy, that they would be able to reconnect to their legacy and to feel that they had some kind of story they could tell in a place that was safe. Now, based on that, you would think this is, and it was a remarkable achievement, but I'm going to caveat that by saying, when we first did it, we did put energy in, and I would call it the 300 plastic chairs problem. So we put the energy in, they've acquired the funding for the television, but there was no seating. So for a long while, they could not get enough people to come into the hall because they had to stand. And who wants to, well, people do stand, but what we realized that we hadn't think sufficiently holistic enough. And then we were able to find funding for the 300 plastic chairs. And from that, we did start to see the weddings, the major life significant events, marriages, births, deaths, all being celebrated because of these 300 plastic chairs. In talking about women, obviously, I'm going to, because my area really focuses on about how energy is gendered, and nowhere more so than in the refugee camp-based setting. So some of the interventions we did were, we hoped to find forms and opportunities for women to have more engagement in meaningful participation in energy use, application, design, and deployment. So we did access free energy, but they could access free energy by charging their mobile phones. And as I said, part of the committees that oversaw these mobile phones that were part of these solar street mobile phone sockets that were part of these solar street lights did empower some women. But when it came to the hall, and we found that women didn't use the hall because they would send their men or their sons, because they would often stay at home and do chores in the house. So while their phones were being charged, they weren't actually taking time out from their domestic chores. So they were still very much labor-intensive work. It was the men who were able to go and watch TV while the phones were being charged. The second point is one of our interventions was solar mobile lanterns that actually we did a step count. We incorporated a sensor so we could see how mobile the lanterns were being used. And the feedback was, out of all the interventions we did, this the women felt had the greatest impact on, and they felt they got the greatest benefit from. However, from our data, we could see the lanterns were static, which meant that the lanterns weren't being used in the way we thought they were. They weren't using them to go outside. They were actually using them as lighting within their home. And that really brings to the fore, you know, we had the expectation that we were giving them more freedom of movement, but that wasn't the case. The third thing we found was we improved straight lighting with the hope that women who often did small scale stalls, because it's as a way of generating income, could work longer hours. And indeed, you know, they were able to stay out longer to be able to sell their goods. But what was really interesting, there was a difference with when asked what they would do with the savings. When men were asked what would they would do with the savings that would come because they could work longer, they said we'd buy more electrical goods. We'd buy a fridge or a fan or an item. But women often would say, no, we're going to use the savings to send our children to school, to buy better food, to invest in our business. So we found there was a very distinctive divide over how and what they would do in their future energy, kind of as energy savers. And that, again, was unexpected. So where do we go next? What are the pathways to inclusion and sustainable energy systems? And I think it is worth noting that not all energy in any kind of energy intervention, because they are gendered, that sometimes the ones that are the most useful are not always the ones that are that produce the best benefits for women. And we really, or for those that are marginalized or vulnerable or have a heightened exclusion from society. And it's very difficult in a camp-based setting where it seems we look at perhaps survival, that we need to think more about how we ensure that the community thrives. So I would suggest there's 4 things that we should consider. One is that as a researcher, and I'm talking in a research context, and I caveat that because obviously I'm talking about an idealized vision. And I'm sure those that are practice-based would say that that is that is idealized. But I would say before we start any kind of discussion, we need to take an intersectional lens. We need to really critically analyze those intersections that create greater discriminations for certain communities who are already vulnerable. Secondly, I think it's really important we start to move the conversation for camp-based refugees from them being passive recipients of energy systems into being agents of change. How can we create them so they have agency and decision-making, and energy systems are not seen as something that is given to them, but something they can engage, utilize, and have ownership over. The third thing, of course, is design flexibility. The context by the nature of camp-based refugees, although we know that on average it's 18 years and above people will be in camps, there still needs to be a recognition that they live in insecure housing and politically complex situations. So the design systems need to reflect that. And renewables, because they use a lot of new technologies, need to start to be able to see how they can reflect and respond to those complexities. And lastly, whenever we think about support packages for energy systems, we can only deal that if we treat it as an ecosystem. It is not enough to introduce energy interventions. We need to have a package of support around it so that all can maximize those benefits. And that's it. So thank you. And I'm now going to hand over to our next panelist. If I can.
Hello, everyone. Are my slides visible? Okay. So I'm very thrilled to have been invited to this because a lot of the panelists, they have been huge inspiration for my own work. My own work has been built on theirs. And I believe this panel discussion was organized at a very good time because we just came back from field work for a research project recently. And also because of the recent Refugee Forum in December. So I feel like this is a very good timing for this panel discussion. I would like to take this opportunity to present for the first time findings from a recent field project, which I feel will be very useful for the discussions which we've already had and will further have. So when transient people traverse borders, they frequently set up off-grid with little to no access to power. In such situations, energy is usually implemented in a very unsystematic way and relies more on free distribution than market-based methods. So as such, refugee settlements often lack sustainable infrastructure, and many of them really rely on inadequate lighting and cooking facilities. However, scholarly work has only started to recognize this as a huge field that deserves attention, and which is why there is still a huge dearth of knowledge in this area. So existing research, whatever we have now, they are still lacking because most of them focus mostly on the techno-economic aspects of energy systems, overlooking the socio-technical implications for refugees. Additionally, humanitarian aid tends to favor techno-saviorist approaches, neglecting the lived experiences and perspectives of refugees in decision-making processes. These gaps underscore the urgent need for more comprehensive approaches to address energy poverty and injustice in refugee contexts. So what we've done for our work is we sort of looked at the critical gaps in energy research within displaced communities through the case study of the Rohingya refugees resettled in Bangladesh. So just a brief background, they originate from the Myanmar's Rakhine state, and they face ethnic persecution, and the ethnic crackdowns led to the major influx in 2017, although there have been sort of a migratory trend before 2017, but it's just the major flux that occurred in 2017, which resulted in 1 million refugees being settled in ad hoc camps in Cox's Bazar. So the refugees are now resettled in densely populated and disaster-prone camps, and they face a myriad of challenges, one of them being related to energy. So in Cox's Bazar, how it works is there are different sectors that sort of that deal with different kinds of interventions, along with partnership with a host government agency. So for energy provision, we have IOM and UNHCR working with the RRC, which is the government agency that works as a focal point for collaboration between the different partner agencies. But despite all the efforts, energy needs of the refugees remain poorly understood. So for this study, we delved into how refugees, particularly Rohingya refugees, access and utilize energy and the broader implications for the SDG framework. So for this, we explored two key questions. First, how energy provision, access, and governance unfold in refugee camps and their implications for energy justice. Second, we examined the interconnectedness between the refugees' access to energy as typified by SDG 7 and other SDGs, shedding light on its impact on their overall welfare and well-being. So to answer our research question, we sought the help of two theoretical frameworks, the energy justice framework and the SDG frameworks. I'm just gonna go through them in a very rushed way. So energy justice is grounded in the principles of distributional recognition and procedural justice, and it addresses the vital links between energy and social equity, aiming to ensure fair access to energy services, recognize diverse needs, and also facilitate inclusive decision-making. So while SDG 7 aspires for universal energy access, it often overlooks the nuances of procedural and recognition justice. So what we aim to do by combining the two framework is, we hope that energy justice would complement SDG 7 by reinforcing sustainable development for all, ensuring that just transition does involve everyone and it leaves no one behind. So to answer our research questions, we conducted 40 semi-structured interviews with members of the refugee community across 7 camps. And we focused our questions related to their energy access, their interaction with energy technologies, and also to what extent they participated in energy-related decision-making. We also interviewed a representative from the RRRC office to understand what the priorities were when they designed energy policies in the camps. And we also saw the help of some other techniques like informal discussions, observation in the camps, and so on. So I now present to you the findings of the project in the form of the 3 injustices that we saw happen in the camps. So in terms of distributional injustice, what we saw is initially when the refugee influx happened in 2017, humanitarian efforts were primarily prioritizing health and sanitation, leaving the majority to depend on firewood for cooking. Some received alternative fuels like compressed rice husks and LPGs. However, electrification remained limited, with only a fraction benefiting from things like solar lanterns and solar panels. Later, over the next few months, after the refugee crisis happened, overhead grid lines and solar grids were installed, but these were for hospitals and government offices, and households still had to rely on intermittent sources like solar panels and batteries. So when we were interviewing, there's a trend that we found that each household, they had like about 2 to 3 lights and occasionally, if at all, a fan. Few owned inverters for charging their phones or batteries. And in the recent months, in terms of cooking fuel, LPG emerged as a primary cooking fuel, and this is mainly supplied by the NGO and the Bangladeshi government. So even though a lot of these energy sources were environmentally benign, they are unreliable and inadequate. For instance, the solar panels exhibited poor performance because of the low power and challenges due to the weather. So the camps are sort of located in a position which is sort of like I mean, considering the monsoon season of Bangladesh, it becomes really unreliable, this power from the solar panels. Lights are typically used for about 3 hours daily, even less during rainy seasons. However, practical issues arise when refugees try to use lights and fans concurrently. So if they use like light for a long period of time, they cannot use fans. And maintenance responsibilities, repairs, they mainly fall on the refugee members or sometimes local electricians, highlighting the strain on refugee households. Thus, we've seen that appliance abandonment was quite common in the camps because they just could not afford to take care of the technologies. And inconsistent solar panel performance prompted the use of candles or kerosene lamps, which were a huge fire hazard because there have been a lot of fire incidences in the camps because of how the shelters are made. So they were very anxious about using such energy technologies, but this was like a last resort for them. And then LPG became the primary cooking fuel, but there were insufficient allocations. And there's been recent reductions in gas provisions, which have forced households to not only ration, but also in some cases resort to fuel wood. Remarkably, what we have seen is refill cycles are similar for families of different sizes. So the average household size is about 6 members, but then we have families that are made of only 2 members, and families that are made of like 12 members, and they're all given on average the same refill cycles. So this leads to inequities where smaller households enjoy longer cycles. So refill cycles have been further shortened after the introduction of technologies such as pressure cookers, which are often not appropriate considering the refugees' needs. So this underscores the distributional challenges that refugees face within the constraints of camp life. So I now shed light on the complexities underlying the electrification efforts and the consequent recognition injustices. Firstly, the host government's concerns about environmental fragility of the location and the energy security of Bangladesh as a whole sort of hindered household electrification efforts in refugee settlements. Additionally, refugees have mentioned that there has been a stricter regulation from 2020 onwards, where they severed previously established connections with adjacent host communities. So we had seen that before 2020, a lot of them were sharing electricity with the host community, and they were sort of paying rent to them in exchange for electricity, but then after 2020, that was completely stopped. And they when we asked them what they felt about this, they mentioned that the government was not treating us equally because we are refugees. And some of them also mentioned that it could be because of the recent fire incidences that were like growing in numbers, and they were quite suspicious in nature because it's suspected that many of them may have been intentional in nature. However, the government clarified that these regulations actually targeted illegal grid connections. So refugees face barriers to accessing electricity meters due to documentation requirements because they do not have land right documents or passports or NIDs or anything. So this further, so they need these documents to sort of access electricity meters. So this further worsened the inequality. So while sharing electricity with host community members, it's still possible. Theoretically, the rising electricity prices now pose an additional obstacle. So we've also seen that the refugees had complained about how the LPG distributors had used very problematic language when justifying the recent rationing. So whenever they try to use energy to celebrate religious festivals and observances, the LPG distributors sort of saw this indulgence to be frowned upon, which we found quite problematic. And our fieldwork also revealed a stark lack of refugee involvement in energy governance, leading to dismal energy security outcomes. So there has been very minimal efforts to engage refugees in the governance setting for energy related decision making. A lot of this were hindered by political and institutional barriers. So under the energy justice framework, this top-down governance approach violates the procedural justice principles, perpetuating exclusion and poor representation within the refugee community. So the emergency focused energy access goals, which is usually the common scenario in the Rohingya refugee camps, coupled with the dwindling foreign aid. So recently there's been a huge foreign aid cut down. So for example, the food ration has dropped from USD 12 per person per month to $9 to $8 per person per month, leaving only 9 cents per meal. These dwindling foreign aid as well exacerbates refugee energy poverty. Insufficient funding and exclusionary governance drive refugees to desperate measures, such as selling energy technologies for food, and there has been also cases of thefts that have been reported. So in refugee camps, the current energy access and governance situation highlights glaring energy injustices impacting refugees' well-being and sustainable development. Despite criticisms of SDG 7 favoring modern energy proliferation over eliminating energy poverty, pursuing SDGs is crucial for tackling energy deprivation and restoring energy justice in humanitarian contexts. So our analysis uncovers tight connections between energy poverty and other SDGs in the camps. However, for the interest of time, I focus on 3 key energy nexuses. So first is the very prominent one that was sort of emerged from our interviews was the energy, food, health nexus. So the impact of energy poverty on Rohingya refugees extends beyond just energy access, because we found that it was affecting their food security and health as well. So due to the fuel scarcity, cooking became very infrequent, and many people were also skipping meals, and the lack of refrigeration were also leading to cold meals. And then there was a lot of bulk cooking going on for large families, which, because with the lack of refrigeration, had risks of food spoilage, contributing to health issues like diarrhea. Many refugees also were sort of used things like old clothes when they ran out of LPGs, which sort of exposed them to indoor air pollution. Additionally, energy access affects access to clean water and sanitation. So while the NGOs sort of installed solar-powered water pumps, poor maintenance and limited coverage leave many households without sufficient water, prompting some to resort to illegal electricity purchases to power communal pumps. The second nexus that we found was the energy-gender nexus. So gendered barriers illustrate how inequitable energy access intersects with gender-based violence, becoming a form of energy and injustice. For instance, households tend to prioritize male energy needs, impacting education access, as households often prioritize the education of boys over girls. Safety concerns also arise from poorly lit communal areas, which causes women to limit latrine visits, especially at night. And then inefficient fuel wood uses used for cooking was also found to worsen the health for women and children who are more exposed to that environment without proper ventilation. The third and final energy nexus that we found was the energy's intersection with built environment and health. So the challenges faced by Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar underscore the urgent need for improved energy access and infrastructure. Without adequate lighting, households resort to kerosene lamps, posing health and fire risks, and the inadequate shelter design exacerbate these challenges because of the poor ventilation and also the extreme heat. That's very, because the refugee camps are very highly densely sort of built. The heat builds up and it creates like an urban heat island effect, which impacts residents' well-being, especially during the hot summer months. Additionally, reliance on fuel wood for cooking leads to respiratory issues, particularly for women, as we've seen before. And health risks from insects and disease vectors are also common, especially during the monsoon season due to the limited access to electricity and lighting. And this type of energy sources available often proves inadequate for preventing climatic conditions, especially during severe weathers like cyclones and floods. So to conclude, in examining the energy landscape within the Rohingya refugee camps, it's clear that energy poverty profoundly impacts sustainable development and well-being. Limited energy access and governance challenges shape daily life for refugee households, leading to unique energy injustices. Distributional injustice, for example, restricts the energy provision due to funding constraints and complex camp locations. And then we saw recognition and justice, which arise from undervaluing refugee energy needs, and as well as the restrictive policies instituted by the host state. And then we saw procedural injustice, which stems from inadequate platforms for refugees to raise their voice, and as well as the waning international attention to the crisis. These injustices worsen energy poverty, hindering sustainable development. And we saw that these produce ripple effects across various dimensions of well-being and welfare, such as food, gender, education. So this is why we felt that addressing these energy injustices is vital for refugee welfare, as well as the achievement for the UN's SDGs. So when we were working and interviewing the refugee members, some recommendations sort of popped up very naturally. So for example, first of all, the pursuit of energy justice for displaced populations demands a holistic approach that transcends borders and disciplines. So it requires policies that address wider geopolitical and social issues, including conflict, displacement, and ecological considerations. Recognizing refugee-specific energy needs is very important, and necessitating tailored policies that account for gender disparities, culture norms, and environmental factors. This approach entails integrating energy justice with SDG policies. And we also need, because of the dwindling foreign aid that we have observed in the refugee camps, diversified funding strategies, including private sector partnerships, are crucial to ensure sustained energy provision and mitigate the impacts of energy poverty. And moreover, promoting collaborative governance structures that involve refugees in decision-making is also essential to mitigate incidences of procedural injustices. By embracing pluralism in energy sources and technologies and fostering transparency and accountability, we can prioritize the well-being and empowerment of all community members. As we navigate the complexities of energy poverty in displaced populations, it is incumbent upon the global community to pave the way for dignified existence and empower the refugees on their journey toward energy justice. So before ending my presentation, I just leave you all with three critical questions about the future of displaced populations within a just transition framework. One, how can we how can future energy transitions account for the needs of the growing number of refugees, migrants, and displaced populations that are at a state of flux? 2, how can the energy security and sustainable development of such populations be ensured when their very presence is deemed temporary and their settlements makeshift? And 3rd, how can long-term energy-related strategies be devised for displaced populations in protracted crisis, resettled in inadequately endowed host countries, as efforts from international humanitarian organizations gradually diminish over time in lieu of the next inevitable crisis? Thank you very much for your time and attention. I look forward to receiving any comments or questions you may have.
Thank you all. This was great. I think it raised, thank you, Nazifa, thank you, Alison and Sarah. You all raised excellent questions and issues and challenges. And we have a number of questions, but I'll use the monopoly right of being the moderator. I'll start the question. I'll pitch it to Sarah, but please, Alison and Nazifa, as you participate in. The numbers you showed, Sarah, is amazing in terms of the decline of accessible energy, including fuel and electricity in this settlements and needs, is mind-blowing. And what are the main obstacles? Like, is it because of increased number of refugees during that period, or decreased provision of both sustainable energy and also electricity and fuel? And Nazifa and Alison's findings also collaborate with that not reduced dependence, but increased dependence and lack of availability during that period. So what are the main challenges? What is causing this?
There's so many challenges. It's hard to know where to start, really. I guess the most important thing to say about the numbers specifically is those numbers don't necessarily represent a decline in access to energy in terms of individual households. So it's not that you're sitting in your home or your business and you're losing access to power or firewood or fuel, although that is the case for some people. The massive change in those numbers is really, as the core of why those numbers are changing so much, is because the number of displaced people has increased so rapidly, and that the people who are newly displaced, if you like, if you can call it that, aren't receiving any support with accessing in energy. So that's one factor that's going into those numbers. And another is that the locations in which people are being displaced aren't necessarily being analysed, and data isn't being collected. So people are assuming that there's no access to energy there because that provision is not through humanitarian systems. So even if people are managing to independently access energy, for example, by going and buying it from an enterprise or cutting down trees and collecting firewood that way, that hasn't been given to them by a UNHCR energy team, and therefore they are counted as zero. So what I would say is that those figures represent access to sustainable energy. They represent, as what the other speakers were presenting, access to modern energy is almost non-existent. But many people still use firewood and charcoal and batteries and burning sticks for lighting and that sort of thing. In terms of the solutions for and the barriers to provision, they are enormous. And when we started the GPA, we started scoping out, and all we found was problems. Everybody said money is the biggest problem. Oh, we can't afford it. We can't afford to buy firewood or modern energy or modern cooking energy for everybody. We can't give everybody ovens. It's too expensive. A solar power is too expensive. Everything's too expensive. We just don't have a budget for it. And that is a huge problem, of course. But what we actually found when we dug into some of the different camp environments, especially, was that huge amounts, millions of pounds, were being spent on energy. Very often they were being spent on diesel generators for camp operations, and they were flying in like whole planes full of diesel. They were trucking in diesel from God knows where. They were sometimes buying tankers of diesel and fuel and shipping it across the desert, so that operations had energy, but households didn't. And so we found actually that there was millions and millions of dollars every year being spent on energy. And there's some really good reports available on that from Chatham House about the millions of pounds and dollars being spent on these topics. So we discovered it's not actually so much of a money problem, and the donors were so willing to spend money on it. It's how that money is being spent, and it's a humanitarian institutions problem, and the fact that they just don't know how to do this. They don't have the staff capacity, they don't have the knowledge. As far as they're concerned, if they buy a solar lantern and give it to everybody, that's the job done. But as we all know, solar lanterns last 2 years, maybe 3 if you're lucky, maybe 2 months if you're not. And then you need to do another one and another one. And also that's only basic lighting. That's equivalent of a light bulb or 2 in your house. That is not powering your mobile phone. It's not powering a dishwasher. It's not, you know, powering your oven. It's not fuel for cooking. And so we started to challenge some of these norms. But yeah, I wouldn't know where to start with answering your question. See the canon of literature for like the thousands of problems we encountered. The biggest one I would say is just lack of understanding about what energy is and how it works. And to some extent, I don't really need to explain that to the people on this call because you're energy experts, you know about energy. But the humanitarians we work with on a daily basis were like, it's just some light bulbs. Like, what's the problem? Which is not accurate representation of the energy sector. Sorry, I don't know if that really answered your question or was just a rant about the last 10 years, but.
No, definitely. And I think a follow-up question, and several also panelists raised it, and our participants too, is the I think contradiction between some of these settlements are permanent, not temporary, and the approach to them is as if they are temporary settlements, and there are many examples around the world, and Palestinian refugees is a good example. For decades, these people are displaced and they are in temporary refugee camps, which are not temporary. I think that also reflects to a degree the energy needs and responses that are provided. It also affects who is in charge. Is it governments like that maze of names that you put in one of your slides, including many private actors, NGOs, and governmental or intergovernmental actors, approaching this question as if it's a temporary solution or problem that needs a temporary solution that includes the responses. So what do you think, like all of you, in terms of like to what role or to what degree this plays a role, this approach that this is a temporary problem that needs temporary fixes versus is this a permanent problem that also shapes our responses, like a permanent electric grid versus solar lanterns? Or that's not something the actors in the field want to even consider or approach this as a permanent issue that needs a permanent solution?
So I'll just kind of address some of that, because not only do I work with refugees, we're also working with communities that are in Rwanda that are at the risk of fuel vulnerability. So we work with some of the most vulnerable marginalized communities. And the issue is the political will. Once you start seeing refugee camps as a permanent fixture, you then have to start implementing an infrastructure. And often these camps are in localities where the infrastructure is poor per se. And so if you invest in strengthening an infrastructure and the host community around it don't have a similar investment, it very well will ferment, push back, but also not do the very thing which you want to do, which is where you want everyone to thrive within that community. And I think the challenge is how we, as governments, as humanitarian agencies, how we see the giving the refugee, we talk about refugees as if they have no agency, and if they're camp-based, we found in particularly in Rwanda, they were born, their parents lived there, some of them even their grandparents, and so you're talking about generational communities. So how do we go about it? And we're working with the Rwandan government with their energy government too, because they want everyone to go on the grid. But some of it where these areas cannot be on the grid, it's too complex, it's too expensive, they're too rural. So we have to look at decentralized systems, but they themselves still have to be permanent structures. Renewables, can be decentralized. They're fantastic, but they still have a certain amount of permanency and they still run at a cost. So who is going to pay that cost? How is it going to be paid? Should we only expect, can we give camp-based refugees some dignity by allowing them to pay for some of that cost? But how affordable can we make it so it doesn't increase their fuel poverty? And I'm not saying we have solutions, but these are the things we've got to ask, because if you allow them to have some kind of financial investment in their energy, I think you are giving them back some kind of autonomy, because then they are not being given to, they can make demands because they're paying for it. So that's how I feel that it really does have to have that political impetus and vision.
So I can only speak from the perspective of the Rohingya refugee population, because a lot of my research is based on that. So what I see is, from the government perspective, they only believe that repatriation is the only sort of alternative to this. And this is why this is still very much treated as a very temporary settlement. And this is why their shelters are so fragile and all the interventions are so short term. But then we also need to understand, so what they're perceiving the situation as an emergency situation, but how long does an emergency last? And really, that's a question, right? So we also see the sort of negative impacts of the viewing all of these interventions as emergencies, because we see that there's a lack of ownership of the technologies. Some of them are not appropriate. There's just not enough will to sort of include refugees in these sort of policy making, in these decision making. Something else that I found very interesting is the government does not call them refugees. They call them forcibly displaced Myanmar nationals. So there's like a political side there, because Bangladesh is not a signatory to the Refugee Convention. What started off like as a humanitarian effort, they're now increasingly moving towards a more security approach. They see that with the increasing population and, you know, sort of the increase and how under-resourced they are, they're increasingly trying to sort of curb more people from coming in the recent months as well. There's been a lot of conflict with the Myanmar government and rebel groups in Myanmar, which has resulted in hundreds of refugees fleeing to Bangladesh. And with the dwindling sort of foreign aid, we're trying, I think a lot of the priorities going towards the basic necessities like food and health, and energy is sort of seen as this luxury for many of them. So, but then the government is also recognizing, so the way the refugees are located, they're called reserve forests. So it's been a protected forest. And they see that if they're not providing LPGs, they need to resort to fuel wood, which is not only harmful for them in the long run, but also for the local biodiversity as well. So I think it's very, I think it's beyond us to sort of understand whether we should go for short-term or long-term. What I think is more holistic sort of policy making, which sort of integrates, you know, when we are sort of implementing energy policies, we shouldn't see them as just energy policies. We saw that these have interlinks with sort of food, health, gender. So I think the perspective needs to shift. Like these policies need to sort of designed in using a more sort of systems approach that sort of, you know, addresses these links, and people see that these have co-benefits across other dimensions as well.
And just to come in on the, sorry, if I could add one small thing on the temporary, you know, versus permanence thing, and Firat, you mentioned there that many of these camps are permanent. They're permanent in the sense they've been there for a long time. And, you know, the Palestinian displacement since 1947, 1947 was a really long time ago, but UNRWA is still set up as a temporary agency, and the camps there and the way people are living are temporary. It's permanent in the sense of it's been there a really long time, but legally it's not permanent. And that is the case in many, many places. And the Rohingya, recent Rohingya displacement that my other colleague was talking about are, you know, there's been people there since 1970 or so, correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah. And so it's a political dimension, as both speakers highlighted, that impacts on that. And there's also the element of competition with the local host population, as we see, and as Alison and I know all about in Rwanda, people saying, well, why are refugees on this hilltop getting amazing energy access services when we, the host population at the bottom of the hill, are not grid connected? And so, you know, if you do it for one group, you have to do it for all in the sake of justice and fairness and everything else. And so it becomes this huge mired problem, a truly wicked problem in my mind. So there is no, you know, short answer to is it temporary or not, because you have other case studies like in Jordan where people were very much seen as being temporary and that they would go home to Syria. And yet the Jordanian government stepped up and said, actually, there are going to be people here, whether it's Syrians or somebody else. You know, Jordan is a safe haven in the Middle East. And so we will invest in this as a semi-permanent structure so that whoever lives here in the future, Jordanians, Iraqis, Palestinians, whoever, you know, whatever the next war in the Middle East is, we will have a refugee camp ready to go. And it turns out the Syrian conflict goes on and on and on, and it's Syrian still, but they planned for that and they had policies and structures to do that. So when the national government is supportive, as they have been largely in Jordan, you get a totally different picture and different set of physical infrastructures. So it's just, yeah, wildly complex, as I seem to end every presentation or every discussion saying.
Thank you very much. And we are slightly over time, and for the sake of time consideration of you and also our other participants, I have to say thank you. Nazifa, Alison, Sarah, this was really enlightening in terms of challenges and also the complexity of the structure. It's not just electricity or energy, but it crosses multiple issues from gender to economics, to politics, to autonomy, to safety, security. Thank you for your research and thanks for joining our webinar. And we'll end it now. Thank you again. Bye-bye.